You're watching NewsX World. Let's first take a look at our top stories. Tensions have escalated in the Middle East after Iran and Israel carried out strikes following an unprecedented assault on Iranian nuclear and military facilities. Israel says Tehran will burn if further missiles are launched after waves of attacks kill 2 and injure dozens. Meanwhile, world leaders have continued in calls for de-escalation and calm amid rising tensions as the Pope calls for responsibility and reason from both sides. Meanwhile, Iran says nuclear talks with the US scheduled for Sunday in Oman are meaningless after the strikes on nuclear infrastructure. The government of India has stressed the need for an extended surveillance of the Boeing 787 Dreamliner series. Ram Manohar Naidu, the civil aviation minister, highlighted that the decoding of a recovered black box will provide further information on why the plane crash occurred. Ukraine says they have received around 1,200 bodies from Russia, though Russian news agency TASS reports it didn't receive any of its dead soldiers. President Zelensky says that fighting is raging on as Russia's defense ministry reports to have destroyed 110 Ukrainian drones. 1,800 protests are scheduled for today in the US as preparations continue ahead of Donald Trump's military parade. Meanwhile, US Marines deployed to Los Angeles have made the first known detention of a civilian amidst anti-immigration protests. Meanwhile, Kilmar Abrego Garcia, the migrant returned to the US after being wrongfully deported to El Salvador, will remain detained for now ahead of his trial. It comes after he pleaded not guilty, accused of conspiracy to smuggle migrants into the country. Kazakhstan says that Russian nuclear giant Rosatom will lead the construction of the first atomic power plant in the country. Proposals were also made by the state-owned China National Nuclear Corporation, as well as French and South Korean companies. And South Africa have beaten Australia in the World Test Championship final at Lords after a stunning comeback. Opener Aidan Markram was the hero for the victors, scoring a calculated but majestic 100 as the South African side chased down an unlikely total of 282 in London. We start this hour in the Middle East. Israel's strikes have now claimed the lives of 9 Iranian nuclear scientists. Those killed include leading experts in physics, mechanics and materials engineering. Iran has confirmed the deaths through semi-official channels. On the other hand, Israeli military states that 7 of their soldiers have been lightly injured after an Iranian missile hit central Israel. This escalation has dealt a fatal blow to nuclear diplomacy, with Iran now declaring talks with the United States meaningless. Tehran cites US President Donald Trump's open support for Israel's strikes as a betrayal. Meanwhile, a new wave of strikes has hit East Azerbaijan, Lorestan and Kermanshah. Explosions were heard in Tabriz, with smoke seen rising. In Asadabad County, 2 were killed and 5 injured. Iran activated air defences in multiple cities. Meanwhile, Israeli Defence Minister Israel Katz has issued a stark warning. If missile attacks continue, Tehran will burn. Well, this, of course, comes amid heightened escalations following that first huge strike from Israel onto Iran nuclear and military facilities overnight. Further escalation, Iran striking back with around 150 ballistic missiles. Joining us to discuss all of these developments and the ramifications of them is Ambassador Daniel Carman, a former ambassador of Israel to India, who is joining us from Tel Aviv. Daniel, thank you ever so much for being here with us in this difficult time. I hope you and your family are okay. What is the feeling in Israel now in the aftermath of these strikes, where we know several missiles got through the Iron Dome defences due to the sheer number that was sent from Tehran?
Well, Josh, thank you very much for having me. And indeed, we're going through very difficult times. But I think the alternative would have been much worse, knowing where the Iranians were going. Um, uh, uh, is in what I would call the 11th or almost the 12th hour of the change in their in the pace of their nuclear development program and the weaponization program, which are two elements that I would call a double existential threat to Israel through nuclear and ballistic missiles capabilities, adding to what we've been unfortunately almost used to, which is the use of proxies to attack Israel in various ways, the Houthis with ballistic missiles and other proxies in other ways. Of course, the blow to Hezbollah a few months ago changed some of the equation, but what really worried us and brought the Iranians to the 11th hour and a half is really the development of nuclear capabilities and weaponization, the ballistic side of it. And we see the threat of ballistic missiles in the last few days. You were talking about 150. I think the number is much higher, but ballistic missiles, we're talking about 175, close to 200 in the last 48 hours, which affects all of us. And one correction I would make to all of us when talking about the two sides of the strikes is the fact that Israel, as you rightly said, has been attacking nuclear facilities and military facilities and nuclear scientists and military leadership in Iran. Iran has been hitting civilians. And we only have to quote and to listen what their leaders are saying. They're talking about a revenge, and they're talking about retaliation. But what they're doing is to attack civilians. You mentioned 7 Israeli soldiers were slightly hit in central Israel. There were 4 people, killed, civilians killed in the blast over residential areas in 5 or 6 different landfall sites, and about 80 people were injured that way or another. So this difference between attacking in a preemptive strike military and nuclear facilities on the one hand, and attacking civilian residential areas on the other is not something that I would put in the same equation.
Yes, Ambassador Carmen, I will just add that there have been civilian casualties reported in Iran, dozens, over 70, though the information around the collateral damage or whether these are independent civilian strikes, we haven't had confirmation yet. But what I do want to talk about, Ambassador, is the timing of this large-scale assault on military and nuclear facilities within Iran. This coming ahead of another talk, a 6th round of talks between the US and Iran over a potential nuclear deal. Now, earlier on the show, we had another guest on who said that the US had given a 60-day timeline, and on day 61, Israel struck. But we know that the 2015 nuclear deal with Iran took years to plan and carry out with the support of multiple countries, including Russia, Western nations, China as well. We also have to acknowledge that Steve Witkoff has been placed into this position but isn't historically a politician or a diplomat. So do you think that more time could have been given to avoid this escalation and avoid deaths that have come as a result of that attack on nuclear and military facilities within Israel?
Well, this is one of those events and crises that you never know because you don't have an implementation of both options. One option was chosen, by Israel, and for a very good reason, because we understood our people, our intelligence, military intelligence, the people who are following the developments in Iran have come to the conclusion, as I said before, we're almost at the 12th hour of irreversibility, probably. And what we see through the ballistic missiles that are conventional, that are sent towards Israel, towards the central Israel, paralyzing the whole country for 48 hours, as we now feel on our specifically and personally. You're interviewing me in the safe room, although we are in a recess between launches. It can happen anytime, and maybe during this interview we will be asked to go into the shelters. So I cannot tell you what would be the alternative. I can tell you that there has been acceleration of the development of nuclear weapons in the last few months, a very dangerous, crucial, critical acceleration. And yes, Israel as a sovereign country has decided to exert its right or its obligation for self-defense, and this is what we're doing.
Yes. We hope, of course, you are okay, and I can't start to imagine the psychological impact of being in Israel or Iran at this moment as a civilian. But I want to shift this now as we come towards the end of this discussion, Ambassador, towards the geopolitical aspect. We've heard Pope Leo XIV, we've heard world leaders, both on the traditional side of Iran or Israel as well, calling for a de-escalation, calling for calm. When Israel launched that huge scale attack on infrastructure within Iran, they must have expected that there would be a response. We've now had Israel Katz saying that Tehran will burn if there are further attacks. Was the Israeli military not expecting this to happen? And surely Israel's government knew that if they attacked on this scale, then there would be a response and the potential regional and global geopolitical ramifications off the back of that.
Well, I'm not in the room, and I cannot tell you exactly what the nuances of all the participants, but I'm sure that a reaction was expected. Maybe a bigger reaction was expected, maybe a more Iranian successful in the eyes of the Iranian reaction was expected, but there's no doubt that nobody thought that it would come, unanswered. But I think that the technology that we have shown and the preparations that, according to sources, it has been months in the making. All the preparations brought the Iranian reaction to be smaller than feared, probably. But the big question, and I would pose two questions. Maybe we could debate them in the next few days when the dust settles a little more. One is an affirmation from my side that this is not only an Israeli-Iranian crisis. It's a crisis that involves and worries many countries around the Middle East, including moderate Arab countries. I don't want to speak in their names, but we all know how worried those countries are of the Iranian nuclear development. The big enemy of Iran is not necessarily Israel. The big enemy could be another country in our region, because the vision of the Iranian regime is a historical vision, and I'm not sure we have time to discuss what it means. But they have an historical way of looking at things and where they are going, according to the will of God, as they say. But let's leave it at this moment. It's a Israel-Iranian crisis. It's a regional crisis, and it should worry the whole world. And as we see, leaders around the world are very much worried. Some of them are giving the automatic de-escalation will and wish. We haven't heard from the UN Secretary General, but I can tell you exactly what he will say. Relevant or not, that's another story. What's relevant is the fact that Iranian has to have its nuclear capability development eliminated,
yes,
before we continue with this with the exit strategy, which is essential and should be contemplated also.
Yes,
This is not a
absolutely.
crisis forever. It should be ended as soon as possible.
Yes, Ambassador Daniel Common, we are unfortunately out of time, but thank you for joining us and we wish you safety in this moment of uncertainty. Of course, we will bring you all of the latest that we get from this ongoing situation between Iran and Israel. But we move on now, and a high-level multidisciplinary committee headed by the Union Home Secretary will examine the causes that led to the Air India plane crash in the western Indian city of Ahmedabad, and also suggest comprehensive guidelines to prevent such incidents in the future. During a press briefing today, the Civil Aviation Minister, Ram Mohan Naidu, said that the authorities will conduct an extended surveillance into all Boeing 787 Dreamliner flights. Currently, 34 of these planes are operational in India. The Civil Aviation Ministry has said the committee will not be a substitute for other inquiries being conducted by relevant organisations. As per the ministry, the panel will focus on formulating standard operating procedures for preventing and handling such occurrences in the future, and will publish its reports in around 3 months. Here is what the Civil Aviation Minister had to say.
We do have a very strict protocol, robust protocol, which we follow every time. But even after, when the incident happened, we also felt that there is a need to do an extended surveillance into the Boeing 787 series. So from the DGCA, we have also given an order to do the extended surveillance for the 787 planes. There are 34 in our Indian aircraft fleet today. I believe that 8 have already been inspected, and then with immediate urgency, all of them are going to be done.
This comes as the black box from the flight was also recovered from the roof of the hostel mess building of the BJ Medical College where the flight crashed into. The analysis of the black box, which is a small device that records aircraft information, could provide vital clues about what triggered this disaster. Let's listen again to what the Civil Aviation Minister said.
One important update from the technical investigation which is happening through the AIB is the recovery of the black box yesterday around 5 p.m. from the site. The AIB team believes that this decoding of the black box is going to give a in-depth insight into what would have actually happened during the process of the crash or moments before the crash itself. So we are also eagerly waiting for what the results or the report is going to be once the AIB goes through its full investigation.
Meanwhile, authorities of the Ahmedabad Civil Hospital have so far identified 6 victims on the basis of the DNA samples and initiated the process to hand over the bodies to relatives. Earlier, 8 victims who were identified by their relatives and did not need DNA profiling as their bodies were not damaged had been handed over to their families by the hospital. Hostels of the BJ Medical College that were damaged in the Air India plane crash were being vacated as the Aircraft Accident Investigation Bureau wanted to conduct a probe according to the institution's dean. Well, an extremely tragic incident, and investigations, of course, ongoing to find out the cause of this horrific incident. Joining us to discuss the latest developments is Captain Dr. MJ Augustin Vinod, a former pilot of fighter planes and aviation expert, who is joining us from New Delhi. Captain, thank you ever so much for taking the time to join us and discuss this deeply saddening and despairing news. But something that must be discussed is, of course, this operation and the ongoing efforts to find out why this happened and how it can be avoided in the future. We had that press briefing earlier. We've used a lot of jargon and a lot of information, but in real terms, can you tell us what the next steps are now in terms of the black boxes being found, the investigations going to happen, and the ongoing understanding that will be gained in the coming days and weeks?
Firstly, thank you, Joshua. Point is, there are two aspects to the whole thing. First is the DGC has come out very clearly saying that there is a need to look into the standard operating procedures. So that I'm sure the company as well as the regulators will sit down, work on it, and come out with a new standard operating procedure if there is a need. The second is the black box is out. So what really went wrong, we'll now be able to put our fingers on, which means the time for speculations, time for wild theories, time for probably correct theories, everything is now behind us. Now, this is the time we stand in solidarity with people who lost their lives, both on the ground, as well as people who were in that particular ill-fated aeroplane. See, aeroplane flying in the air, we are not designed to fly in the air. If we were, God would have given us wings, isn't it? It's only, birds are designed to fly in the air, and we are encroaching upon the zone which is meant for other beings to be there. So the gravity, sometime or the other, will get the better of you, which is something which all of us who do air travel must accept. It's not an equipment which is like foolproof. Accidents keep happening all over the world for some reason or the other. Aim is we should, after every accident, learn something and make air a better place, because air is transcends everywhere, and more often than not, we don't have very many borders in air. So to fly like a bird, we need to make air safe, and that is what is going to happen the moment preliminary investigations point towards a particular direction.
Yes.
The aspect about standard operating procedure that DGCA has come out with, Joshua, is going to change the way probably the operations are going to be carried out, especially during the critical phases of the flight. We need to wait and see what kind of changes that it is going to throw about. If you remember, the Tenerife crash gave us the word takeoff to be used only when you're intending to take off or when something related to takeoff is being said. Before that, the word takeoff was used very loosely, even when you're on the run, not on the runway. You were using the word called takeoff. So after that, the runway incursion cases have reduced a lot. So that was an SOP change. So likewise, something, earth-shattering may come or something very specific may come. That we need to wait and watch. Once again, like I said, my candle is up for people who lost their lives, both on the ground and people who were traveling in that ill-fated aeroplane. Over to you, Joshua.
Yes, I do have some news to bring you. I've just received information that Air India in an X post have said that they will be providing an interim payment of 2.5 million rupees to the families of the deceased and to the family of the survivor. Of course, no amounts of money, no amount of payment will be able to make up for the devastation and the pain that so many families, friends, loved ones will be feeling currently. But of course, after a tragedy of this magnitude, efforts are being made, the investigations are ongoing, and more information around the reason for the crash will become clear in time. But Captain, I would like to come back to you, and I'm glad you brought up the humanitarian aspect of this, the moment to mourn, the moment to pray. This is, of course, extremely difficult and unprecedented of this kind. We know that the Boeing 787-8 Dreamliner recently celebrated 5 million flights over a 14-year period, hadn't experienced anything like this. But How can the public, how can people move forward, how can the loved ones move forward and carry on using planes after a disaster of this kind? What is needed from governments, from businesses alike?
A very wonderful question, Joshua. See, when you're designing an aeroplane and when you're designing a particular procedure, you want to cover, I beg your pardon, you want to cover all possible scenarios and all possible places where one could go wrong. And how did you come to know that something could go wrong? It's through various accidents and incidents that happened in the past, isn't it? So every accident or every incident or every accident that didn't happen adds to the statistics for you to go back to the drawing board if there is a need to go back to the drawing board, and go back to the procedures if there is a need to go back to the procedures. In this case, it could be both, because I'm just thinking aloud. In a critical phase of flight, like for example, in a particular aeroplane that Airbus makes, beyond a certain speed, if you lower the gear, lower the wheels, it will not come down, because there is a lock which prevents it from the aeroplane, the gear to come down. Why? Because the gear can at that speed fly away. Similarly, you have something called automatic retraction system, in which the flaps retract automatically based on the speed, because if you don't retract it, the flaps may fly out. And if it is an asymmetric flap damage, you may, probably wing drop to one side and probably crash. So these are the things that came about after certain incident or certain accidents that happened. So I am just thinking aloud that probably they may go back to the drawing board in this case as well. Over to you, Sean.
Captain Dr. MJ Augustin, thank you ever so much for taking the time to speak to us. We will bring you all the developments on the investigation as it continues. But we head now to Europe, and Russia and Ukraine have carried out another round of prisoner exchanges, but this time it's the bodies of fallen soldiers that were returned. Kyiv says it has received 1,200 bodies of dead Ukrainian troops from Moscow as part of an earlier agreement struck in Istanbul. However, Russia claims it hasn't yet received any of its dead bodies in return. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky says prisoner of war swaps will continue until June the 21st, with possible peace talks to follow. On the front line, Zelensky claims Ukraine has halted Russia's advance into northeastern Sumy regions. Battles are now raging along the border, with Russia's maximum advance restricted to 7 kilometers. Meanwhile, Russia claims to have captured Zeleny Kut in eastern Ukraine and destroyed over 100 Ukrainian drones in the past 24 hours. Zelensky admits Ukraine may not be able to regain all lost territory through force and is calling for stronger sanctions to pressure Moscow back to the negotiating table. Well, joining us to discuss the ongoing Russia-Ukraine conflict is Professor Veselin Popovsky, a professor and vice dean at the Jindal Global Law School. Thank you very much, Professor Popovsky, for being here with us. Let's first look at this prisoner exchange of dead bodies. Russia say they haven't received theirs. Ukraine say that 1,200 have been returned. Is this a normal situation to occur? Or is this situation in the first place common, the trade of dead bodies in wartime?
It is very common under international humanitarian law, under the Geneva Convention, to do that. Nothing surprising. It's humanitarian, but it's also military purpose here. Exchanging prisoners of war when they are alive obviously is required. The protection of prisoners of war is also required exactly because we, one side of the conflict, doesn't want our boys to be mistreated. In other words, there is a humanitarian aspect of that, but also a military aspect of that, and that's probably what makes the international humanitarian law strong, because both humanitarian and military purpose are achieved by exchanges as protection as well of the prisoners of war. Nothing surprising. Those will continue, and I'm sure they will continue even beyond 21st of June. There is a goodwill on both sides, which is probably something encouraging finally to see. But that happens, Joshua, in every armed conflict, even between the worst enemy in the past, during the Second World War, in many other conflicts. In Israel and Gaza, we also see prisoners exchange. So there is nothing surprising, and it's a good news, at least for the family of those who can return alive.
Yes, Volodymyr Zelensky says that fighting has been raging on and that his forces have been able to repel Russian advances to only 7 kilometres in recent times. But then he does say on the flip side that without support, without sanctions, Ukrainian troops may not be able to hold out for too much longer. Do you think this is a show of strength in one comment, but also an acknowledgement that more support is needed and a further move to place pressure on Russia from the geopolitical community that is now also facing a potential Middle Eastern conflict that could have wider repercussions as well?
You're absolutely right, Joshua, here. Yes, that's exactly how I read what Zelensky said. These are brave and courageous soldiers. The Ukrainian army does what is best to do. They're absolutely determined to liberate their territories. On another hand, obviously, as you say, part of this statement is to encourage countries around the world to help. Basically, Ukraine is the victim of this war. They need more help, as you say, both in terms of sanctions on Russia, but also in terms of direct support to Ukraine, including military and financial and other support. We will hear those messages from Ukraine. They need more support. Unfortunately, United States under the Trump administration, as we see already for the last 5 months, is unwilling to continue what the previous administration of Joe Biden and Kamala Harris did, which was unequivocal support for Ukraine and strong sanctions on Russia. The hope is that the US administration will also realize that there is no other way out of this tragedy apart from what European and other allies do. Support for Ukraine and sanctions on Russia, and also no negotiations with the aggressor. We see that any attempt to negotiate with Vladimir Putin so far have failed. Russia does not want to negotiate here. Russia does want to kill more civilians in Ukraine. It's so simple. And for that matter, negotiations with Russia do not produce anything, apart from, as we mentioned earlier, prisoners exchange. That's probably the only cooperation we have seen from Russia, is to exchange prisoners of war. Rather, they should also stop the fighting. We don't see any cooperation on any proposal on ceasefire made repeatedly, including by the US administration. Donald Trump is very disappointed by the refusal of Russia to accept even 30 days ceasefire, which was proposed a long time ago already.
Yes. Sorry to interject briefly there, Professor Popovsky. We are running shorter on time, but I do have one final question. We only have around a minute to go. Given the level of escalation that we've seen in the Middle East, do you think there could be any ramifications on the Russia-Ukraine war, given that potential military support might need to be provided if a regional conflict breaks out, and also the spotlight now potentially taken away from this European conflict with the level of loss of life that we might be seeing in the Middle East if it continues to escalate further?
What I would like to see is to recognition that Russia and Iran are absolutely similar countries. They are totalitarian countries with no human rights, with no respect for human lives. And for that matter, they should be treated as allies in those wars. So in a way, Ukraine and Israel are the victims here, and Iran and Russia are the aggressors here. And I think most of the countries in the world are very much aligned with that way of thinking. yes, it's unfortunate to see what happened between Israel and Iran. And again, there was a huge blunder from the United States when they stopped the delivery of 20,000, I think, weaponry to Ukraine, but they put those into the hands of the Israel army, where Ukrainian desperately needs those ammunitions. The two are connected, as I said, mostly because Russia and Ukraine are allies here, and that's why the rest of the world should support Ukraine and Israel.
Professor Veselin Popovsky, thank you ever so much for joining us as always. That is all that we do have time for, but we'll continue to bring you more on the Middle Eastern conflict, Russia-Ukraine conflict, and rest of the ongoing disputes and news from across the world.